The morning sun cast long shadows across Main Street as Harold Jenkins adjusted his worn canvas sack over his shoulder. At 78, his weathered hands told stories of decades of hard work, and his eyes sharp blue beneath bushy white eyebrows revealed a wisdom that most overlooked. Today was the day he'd been waiting for, planning for, dreading for nearly 40 years. The Sterling National Bank stood imposingly at the end of the street, its modern glass facade a stark contrast to the humble storefronts that lined the rest of Millfield. The town had changed dramatically since Harold was a young man, but some things like the truth never changed, regardless of how deeply they were buried. "Morning, Mr. Jenkins," called Sally from the flower shop. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" Harold nodded with a gentle smile. Few people in town really knew him anymore, though he'd lived here his entire life. They saw only an eccentric old man who lived alone in that creaky Victorian house at the edge of town. Today, that perception was about to change forever. As he approached the bank's automated doors, Harold took a deep breath, clutching the sack tighter. Inside was everything he needed: proof of what had been stolen from him, from his family, so many years ago. The security guard gave him a cursory glance as he shuffled inside, dismissing him as just another elderly depositor coming to withdraw his modest pension. The bank was bustling with the Monday morning crowd, young professionals in crisp suits tapping away at their smartphones, tellers efficiently processing transactions, loan officers escorting clients to private rooms. No one paid attention to the old man waiting patiently in line, his worn boots leaving faint dusty prints on the polished marble floor. "Next customer, please," called the teller, a young woman with a name tag that read, Jessica. Her smile was professionally courteous as Harold approached, though her eyes barely met his. "Good morning," Harold said, his voice stronger than his appearance suggested. "I'd like to speak with the bank manager, please." Jessica's smile didn't waver. "Regarding what matter, sir?" Harold placed his canvas sack carefully on the counter. "I've come to claim ownership of this bank. It rightfully belongs to me." For a moment, Jessica stared at him blankly before a small laugh escaped her lips. She glanced at her colleague in the next window, who had clearly overheard and was suppressing a smile. "Sir, I'm afraid that's not possible. Perhaps there's been some confusion. Would you like to make a withdrawal or deposit today?" Harold's expression remained serious. "No confusion at all, young lady. This bank stands on land that belonged to my family. I have all the documentation right here," he patted the sack. "And I'd like to speak to whoever's in charge." Jessica's smile had transformed into a look of amused pity, the kind reserved for confused elderly people who had lost touch with reality. Little did she know that Harold Jenkins had never been more lucid in his life, and the contents of that simple sack were about to turn her world, and the entire town of Millfield, upside down. Harold Jenkins hadn't always been alone. 50 years ago, he'd been the son of John Jenkins, one of Millfield's most respected farmers. The Jenkins farm had stretched across 200 acres of the most fertile land in the county, passed down through 5 generations. Harold had grown up expecting to continue that legacy, to work the land with his wife Martha and their 3 children, but life had other plans. The drought of 1983 had been devastating. Banks across the region foreclosed on family farms, and Sterling Bank, then a small local institution run by William Sterling, had been particularly merciless. Unlike other banks offering extensions and refinancing options, Sterling pushed for immediate repayment of loans. When farmers couldn't pay, he seized their land at a fraction of its value. "You don't understand," Harold muttered to himself as he was escorted by an increasingly concerned Jessica toward the manager's office. Nobody understood. Jessica glanced nervously at him. "Mr. Blackwell will see you shortly, sir. Would you like some water while you wait?" Harold shook his head, his mind drifting back to that fateful day when William Sterling had personally come to the Jenkins farm with the sheriff, eviction notice in hand. His father, proud John Jenkins, had collapsed from a heart attack right there on the porch. He died 3 days later in the hospital, never regaining consciousness. Within months, Sterling had sold most of the foreclosed farmlands to developers at massive profits. The old Jenkins homestead became the site of the new Sterling National Bank headquarters, a cruel irony that wasn't lost on Harold. Martha, unable to bear the pain of remaining in Millfield, had taken the children to her sister's home in Oregon. Harold had stayed behind, driven by a promise made at his father's grave. "Mr. Jenkins?" A deep voice broke through his memories. "I'm Robert Blackwell, branch manager. I understand you wanted to speak with me about ownership of the bank." Robert Blackwell was everything Harold was not: young, polished, confident. His tailored suit probably cost more than Harold spent on clothes in a decade. Behind his practiced smile, though, Harold detected the familiar look of condescension he'd grown accustomed to over the years. "Yes, Mr. Blackwell. I appreciate your time." Harold's voice remained steady as he placed his sack on the desk between them. "I believe you're occupying property that legally belongs to me." Blackwell exchanged a glance with Jessica, who hovered uncertainly by the door. "That's a rather extraordinary claim, Mr. Jenkins. This building has been Sterling National's flagship location for nearly 40 years. 38 years, Harold corrected. Built in 1985, 2 years after William Sterling illegally foreclosed on my family's farm." Recognition flickered across Blackwell's face. "Jenkins, you're related to the Jenkins who owned farmland here?" "I'm the last Jenkins," Harold replied simply. "And I've spent the past 40 years gathering evidence that William Sterling committed fraud to steal this land." Blackwell's smile became strained. "Mr. Jenkins, I sympathize with your family's hardship, but foreclosures were common during that period. The bank acted within its legal rights." Harold slowly opened his canvas sack. "That's where you're wrong, young man. And I can prove it." From within the sack, Harold withdrew a battered leather ledger, yellowed with age. "This is my father's original loan agreement with First National, before Sterling acquired it. And these," he pulled out a stack of payment receipts, meticulously preserved in plastic sleeves, "are proof that every payment was made on time until 3 months before the foreclosure." Blackwell's professional demeanor slipped as he regarded the documents with growing discomfort. "Mr. Jenkins, even if there were irregularities, the statute of limitations doesn't apply to fraud," Harold interrupted, producing another document. "This is an internal memo from Sterling Bank, dated 1 week before our foreclosure notice. In it, William Sterling instructs his loan officers to lose payment records from the Jenkins farm account." The color drained from Blackwell's face. "Where did you get that?" "Margaret Winters kept it," Harold said simply. "She was Sterling's secretary for 20 years. She gave it to me on her deathbed 5 years ago, along with several other interesting documents. Margaret had a conscience, you see. She just didn't have the courage to use it while she was working here." Jessica had moved closer, unable to contain her curiosity. Other bank employees had gathered outside the glass walls of Blackwell's office, whispering among themselves. "This is absurd," Blackwell said, but his voice lacked conviction. "These documents could be forgeries." Harold smiled for the first time since entering the bank. "That's why I also brought these." He reached into the sack one last time and retrieved a small voice recorder. Recordings of William Sterling himself, admitting what he did. "Not just to my family, but to 12 others in Millfield." As he pressed play, the voice of William Sterling, dead now for 10 years but once the most powerful man in town, filled the suddenly silent office. "Of course I doctored the records," Sterling's recorded voice declared with a chilling laugh. "Those farmers were sitting on gold mines and didn't even know it. Jenkins' land alone was worth 10 times what he owed once rezoned for commercial use." Robert Blackwell lunged forward to stop the recording, but Harold pulled it back. The damage was done. Jessica's hand covered her mouth in shock, and through the glass walls, Harold could see the growing crowd of employees and customers, their expressions ranging from confused to concerned. "There's more," Harold said calmly. "Much more. This is just one of 17 recordings I have of William Sterling discussing his creative financing strategies with various partners over the years." Blackwell's professional facade had completely crumbled. "Mr. Jenkins, this is highly inappropriate. I'm going to have to ask you to leave before I call security." Go ahead, Harold replied, undaunted. Call security. Call the police. Call the FBI, for that matter. I've already sent copies of everything in this sack to the State Banking Commission, the District Attorney, and the Millfield Gazette. He checked his watch. In fact, the editor should be receiving my package right about now. The mention of the local newspaper seemed to hit Blackwell like a physical blow. Sterling National had cultivated its image as a pillar of the community for decades, sponsoring Little League teams and 4th of July fireworks, all while the bank's foundation was built on stolen land and broken lives. What do you want? Blackwell finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Harold leaned forward. Justice. The bank fell into chaos over the next few hours. Blackwell made frantic calls to the corporate headquarters while security discreetly escorted customers out, citing a technical emergency. Harold sat patiently in the manager's office, sipping the tea Jessica had thoughtfully brought him, watching the panic unfold with calm detachment. By noon, dark-suited executives from Sterling National's corporate office had arrived, their faces grim as they huddled with Blackwell in the conference room. Occasionally, one would glance through the glass wall at Harold, who smiled and waved back placidly. They're trying to figure out how to make you go away quietly, Jessica observed as she refreshed his tea. She had appointed herself Harold's unofficial ally, fascinated by the unfolding drama and increasingly sympathetic to the old man's cause. I know, Harold nodded. They'll offer money. Quite a lot of it, I imagine. Isn't that what you want? Jessica asked, genuinely curious. Harold's eyes crinkled at the corners. If all I wanted was money, I would have approached them privately. But this was never about money, Jessica. Before she could ask more, the conference room door opened, and the most senior-looking executive emerged, a silver-haired woman in her 60s with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to solving problems with checkbooks. Mr. Jenkins, she said, extending her hand as she entered Blackwell's office. I'm Victoria Reynolds, Executive Vice President of Sterling National. I'd like to discuss resolving this situation amicably. Harold shook her hand but remained seated. Ms. Reynolds. You've come a long way for a conversation that won't take very long. Reynolds settled into the chair across from him, her smile never reaching her eyes. Mr. Jenkins, I've reviewed some of your materials. While there appear to be certain historical irregularities in how your family's property was acquired, the current Sterling National Bank is a different entity than the local bank that existed 40 years ago. We've gone through multiple mergers and acquisitions. The land remains stolen, Harold stated simply. The building stands on theft. Reynolds nodded sympathetically. The bank is prepared to make restitution, substantial restitution for any historical wrongs. We can offer immediate compensation of $2 million, plus an ongoing charitable foundation in your family's name to benefit local farmers. Jessica, still lingering by the door, gasped at the figure. $2 million was more money than most Millfield residents would see in their lifetimes. Harold, however, seemed unimpressed. Interesting. And what would you expect in return for this generosity? A confidentiality agreement, naturally, Reynolds replied smoothly. And the return of all your evidence. All copies? Harold asked innocently. Reynolds' smile tightened. Yes, Mr. Jenkins. All copies. Harold leaned back in his chair, considering. You know, Ms. Reynolds, I've lived a simple life. I don't need much money at my age. But there is something I do need. And what might that be? She asked cautiously. Acknowledgment, Harold said, his voice suddenly vibrating with 40 years of controlled anger. Public acknowledgment of what William Sterling did, not just to my family, but to all the families whose farms he stole through fraud. Reynolds' professional mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the calculation beneath. That would be problematic for the bank's reputation. More problematic than what's already happening. Harold gestured toward the bank's entrance, where several news vans had pulled up, reporters setting up cameras on the sidewalk. The Gazette works fast. The commotion outside had drawn the attention of the other executives, who now crowded around Blackwell's office windows in alarm. Reynolds glanced at her watch and then at the gathering media presence. "Mr. Jenkins," she said, dropping all pretense of friendliness, "you should understand that if you pursue this publicly, our legal team will tie this up in courts for years. You likely won't live to see any resolution." The threat hung in the air between them, but to Reynolds' visible surprise, Harold smiled. "That's where you're wrong, Ms. Reynolds. I don't expect to live forever. I'm 78 years old. But I've already ensured that this fight will outlive me." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a business card, sliding it across the desk to her. It read, "Elena Reyes, attorney at law, class action specialist. Ms. Reyes represents not just me, but the families of 11 other farmers who lost their land to William Sterling's fraud. We've been preparing this case for years, and it doesn't end with me." The color drained from Reynolds' face as she recognized the name. Elena Reyes had successfully won major settlements against several financial institutions for predatory lending practices. "Furthermore," Harold continued, "I've arranged for all documentation to be released to the public through multiple channels in the event of my death or any suspicious accident. The recordings are particularly damning. William Sterling was quite explicit about his methods." Reynolds stood abruptly. "This meeting is over. We'll continue this discussion through proper legal channels." Harold remained seated, remarkably calm. "You have until 5 p.m. today to decide, Ms. Reynolds. After that, Ms. Reyes proceeds with filing the class action suit, and I give my exclusive interview to not just the Gazette, but to every major network that's expressed interest." He smiled kindly. "And believe me, many have." As Reynolds stormed out, gathering her team with sharp gestures, Jessica approached Harold with wide eyes. "What happens at 5 p.m., she whispered. Harold checked his watch again. "Justice, I hope. Or the beginning of it, at least." By 4:30 p.m., the scene outside Sterling National Bank had transformed into something Millfield had never witnessed before. News vans lined both sides of Main Street, reporters conducted interviews with curious townspeople, and social media was ablaze with speculation. The story of an elderly man with a canvas sack challenging one of the region's largest financial institutions had caught fire, spreading far beyond the small town's boundaries. Inside, the bank remained closed to the public, its employees gathered in nervous clusters, whispering about job security and reputations. Robert Blackwell had disappeared into the conference room with Victoria Reynolds and her team of executives and attorneys, their heated discussions occasionally audible through the closed door. Harold sat calmly in the break room, sharing a pot of coffee with Jessica and several other younger bank employees who had approached him timidly at first, then with increasing openness as he recounted the story of Millfield before Sterling's predatory practices changed everything. "My grandparents always talked about how different the town used to be," said a young loan officer named Mark. "They said it was mostly family farms and small businesses before the big commercial developments came in." Harold nodded. "Millfield was founded by farmers. The annual Harvest Festival used to be the biggest event of the year. Every family would bring their best produce, there'd be competitions for the largest pumpkin, the sweetest corn. Your grandparents probably remember. Why didn't anyone fight back when it was happening?" Jessica asked, the question that had been bothering her all day. Harold's eyes grew distant. "Some tried. My father wasn't the only one to lose everything. But William Sterling had connections, judges, commissioners, newspaper editors. And people were afraid. The drought had everybody terrified about the future. Sterling offered cash for land at a time when people were desperate. Those who questioned his methods found themselves isolated." "And you've been planning this revenge all these years?" Mark asked. Harold shook his head. "Not revenge. Justice. There's a difference. I don't want to destroy lives. I've seen enough of that. I want the truth acknowledged and the wrongs made right." He glanced at the clock. "And we'll know very soon if that's possible." At precisely 4:55 p.m., Robert Blackwell appeared at the break room door, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Jenkins. Ms. Reynolds would like to speak with you again." Harold rose slowly, joints stiff from sitting most of the day. As he followed Blackwell, Jessica impulsively reached out and squeezed his hand in encouragement. The small gesture warmed Harold's heart. It had been a long time since anyone had offered him such simple human connection. The conference room was tense with expectation as Harold entered. Victoria Reynolds sat at the head of the table, flanked by attorneys and executives. Her expression had changed. The condescension was gone, replaced by something Harold recognized as grudging respect. "Please sit down, Mr. Jenkins," she said, gesturing to the chair opposite her. Harold complied, placing his ever-present sack on the table between them. Its presence seemed to unnerve Reynolds, a visible reminder of the evidence it contained. "We've been in continuous communication with our board of directors and major shareholders throughout the day," Reynolds began, her tone carefully measured. "Your allegations and the supporting evidence you've presented are concerning to us on multiple levels." Harold said nothing, waiting. While Sterling National maintains that the current institution bears no legal liability for actions taken by the former local bank before multiple mergers and acquisitions, she continued, clearly reciting a prepared statement, "we recognize the ethical obligation to address historical injustices that may have occurred in our institutional lineage." One of the attorneys slid a document across the table. "We're prepared to offer a comprehensive settlement package, Mr. Jenkins. Not just to you, but to all the families represented in your potential class action." Harold didn't touch the document. "I'm listening." Reynolds cleared her throat. "The package includes financial compensation at current market value for all properties involved, with compound interest calculated from the date of foreclosure. Furthermore, Sterling National will establish a $50 million community restoration fund for Millfield, focused on supporting sustainable agriculture and small business development." The figures were staggering, far beyond what Harold had expected. But he remained focused on his primary goal. "And the acknowledgment? The public record?" Reynolds nodded stiffly. "The bank will issue a formal apology acknowledging the fraudulent practices employed by William Sterling. We will erect a memorial on the bank grounds commemorating the original farmlands and the families who worked them. And we will fund an independent historical commission to document the full truth of Millfield's transformation." Harold finally allowed himself to feel the weight of the moment. After 40 years of quiet determination, of being dismissed as a harmless eccentric by the very people who had benefited from his family's destruction, the truth would finally be known. "There's one more thing," he said quietly. Reynolds tensed visibly. "What more could you possibly want, Mr. Jenkins?" "This building," Harold said simply, gesturing around them. "The main branch. I want it donated to the town of Millfield, to be repurposed as a community center and agricultural museum." A murmur ran through the executives. Reynolds started to object, but Harold continued. "Sterling National can build a new branch anywhere else in town. But this land, this specific plot, was the heart of my family's farm for 5 generations. My ancestors are buried less than a mile from here. I don't want it to remain a monument to the man who stole it." The room fell silent as Reynolds considered. Finally, she nodded slowly. "We can accommodate that request, with a 2-year transition period to construct a new branch location." She extended her hand across the table. "Do we have an agreement, Mr. Jenkins?" Harold looked at her outstretched hand for a long moment, thinking of his father, of the promise made at a graveside so many years ago. Then he reached across and shook it firmly. "We do, Ms. Reynolds. We most certainly do." The doors of Sterling National Bank opened at 5:30 p.m. to a crowd that had grown throughout the afternoon. Harold emerged flanked by Reynolds and Blackwell, blinking in the glare of camera lights. Reynolds stepped to the bank of microphones that had been hastily assembled. "Sterling National Bank is announcing today a historic community reinvestment initiative for Millfield," she began, reading from prepared remarks. "After reviewing historical records brought to our attention by Mr. Harold Jenkins, we have discovered significant irregularities in property acquisitions made by the former Sterling local bank in the 1980s, as Reynolds continued her carefully worded statement, acknowledging ethical lapses and failures of oversight, rather than outright fraud. Harold gazed out at the crowd. He recognized old faces, children and grandchildren of families who had suffered alongside his own. He saw Jessica and other bank employees watching with expressions ranging from shock to admiration, and in the back of the crowd, almost hidden, stood Elena Reyes, the attorney who had worked with him for the past 5 years to build this case. She caught his eye and gave him a small nod of victory. When Reynolds finished, she turned to Harold. "Mr. Jenkins, would you like to say a few words?" Harold hadn't prepared anything. He stepped forward hesitantly, suddenly aware of all the cameras and expectant faces. His gaze fell on his worn canvas sack, still clutched in his hand, the vessel that had carried the truth for so long. "I'm not here for myself," he began, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "I'm here for my father, John Jenkins, who died believing he had failed his family by losing our land. I'm here for the other families who lost everything they had built over generations." He paused, looking out at the town he had watched change around him for nearly 8 decades. Millfield was founded by people who believed in hard work and fair dealing. Somewhere along the way, we lost sight of those values. Today isn't about blame or punishment, it's about remembering who we were meant to be. He gestured toward the imposing bank building behind him. "This building will soon become a community center, a place where Millfield can remember its roots and plan for a future that honors them. The settlement announced today will help heal old wounds, but the real healing begins when we acknowledge our past honestly." Harold reached into his sack one last time and withdrew a faded photograph, his family standing proudly in front of their farmhouse, his father's arm around his mother's shoulders, young Harold grinning between his sisters. "This is what was taken from us. Not just land or money, but our place in the community, our sense of belonging. No settlement can fully restore that. But the truth helps." 1 year later, Harold stood on the steps of what had once been Sterling National Bank, watching as workers carefully installed the new sign, Millfield Community Center and Agricultural Heritage Museum. The morning sun glinted off the polished brass plaque beneath it, listing the names of all the farm families whose land had been taken through William Sterling's fraudulent schemes. Jessica appeared beside him, clipboard in hand. As the project coordinator for the new center, she had worked closely with Harold throughout the transition. "The exhibition space is almost ready," she reported, genuine excitement in her voice. "We've collected farming implements from at least a dozen attics around town, and the Historical Society found some amazing photographs of the harvest festivals from the 1920s through the 1970s. Harold nodded, pleased. "And the education program?" "Fully funded for 10 years, Jessica confirmed. The first agricultural scholarships will be awarded next spring to high school seniors interested in sustainable farming practices. We've already had 32 applications. The transformation of Millfield over the past year had been remarkable. The Community Restoration Fund established by the settlement had sparked a renaissance of small-scale agriculture and local businesses. Fields that had been fallow for decades were being cultivated again, this time with organic methods that honored both tradition and innovation. Most meaningful to Harold was the community garden established behind the center, on the exact spot where his mother's beloved vegetable garden had once flourished. Local schools brought children there weekly to learn about growing food and the area's agricultural heritage. "Mr. Jenkins." A familiar voice called from across the street. Elena Reyes waved as she approached, elegant as always in her tailored suit. "I thought I'd find you here." "Ms. Reyes," Harold greeted the attorney warmly. "I didn't know you were coming to town today." "I brought someone who wanted to meet you," she replied, gesturing to a young man who hung back shyly. "This is my nephew, Carlos. He's one of the recipients of the Jenkins Family Agricultural Scholarship." The young man stepped forward, extending his hand nervously. "It's an honor to meet you, Mr. Jenkins. My grandparents lost their farm in California back in the 80s, similar to what happened here. Your story, it inspired me to study regenerative agriculture." Harold felt a lump form in his throat as he shook the young man's hand. "The honor is mine, Carlos. What you're doing, that's the real legacy. Not just remembering the past, but building something better for the future." As they chatted about Carlos's plans for developing drought-resistant farming techniques, Harold noticed a sleek car pull up across the street. Robert Blackwell emerged, now the manager of Sterling National's new branch location on the other side of town. Their eyes met briefly, and after a moment's hesitation, Blackwell raised his hand in a respectful greeting. Harold returned the gesture. There was no animosity between them now, both men had merely been playing their parts in a larger story. Later that afternoon, as the sun began its descent, Harold made his way to the small cemetery on what had once been the eastern edge of the Jenkins farm. He walked slowly through the familiar rows until he reached his parents' graves. "It's done, Dad," he said quietly, placing a fresh wildflower bouquet between the headstones. "Not exactly how I planned it, but maybe better in the end." The breeze rustled through the maple trees that lined the cemetery, their leaves beginning to turn golden with the approach of autumn. "Martha called yesterday," he continued, as if in conversation. "She's bringing the grandkids for the center's opening next month. Says she's ready to see Millfield again after all these years." Harold lowered himself carefully onto the stone bench he'd installed last spring, his old canvas sack now empty of its decades-long burden resting beside him. "You know, there was a time I thought justice meant making Sterling pay for what he did. Making everyone who laughed or looked away suffer as we suffered." He shook his head slowly. "But that wouldn't have fixed anything. It wouldn't have brought you back or restored what was lost." In the distance, he could see the community center, its windows glowing warm in the late afternoon light. People moved in and out, a community reclaiming its heart. Real justice turned out to be about restoration, not retribution. About making things whole again, as much as possible. About creating something new from the broken pieces. As twilight deepened, Harold rose stiffly, gathering his sack. For the first time in 40 years, he felt truly unburdened. The weight he had carried for so long, not just the physical evidence in his sack, but the emotional burden of his promise had finally been set down. The next morning, as had become his custom, Harold sat at the small cafe across from the community center, watching Millfield wake up. The owner, Sophia, brought his usual breakfast without being asked. "Big day today," she commented, refilling his coffee. "The newspaper's running that feature about you and the center." Harold grimaced slightly. Still not comfortable with all that attention. Sophia laughed. "Too bad. You're officially a town hero now. Might as well get used to it." As she moved on to other customers, Harold unfolded the Millfield Gazette. His own face looked back at him from the front page, alongside the headline, "Jenkins Heritage Center, How One Man's Quest for Justice Transformed a Town." The article told the story he now knew by heart: how an old man with a canvas sack had walked into Sterling National Bank claiming ownership, how they had laughed until they realized the truth he carried, how that truth had ultimately healed rather than divided the community. What the article couldn't capture was the quiet satisfaction Harold felt watching new seeds take root in old soil. The settlement money mattered less than seeing children learning about their community's agricultural heritage, less than witnessing small farms flourishing again on the outskirts of town, less than hearing people speak openly about a painful chapter in Millfield's history that had been buried for too long. As Harold finished his breakfast, a school bus pulled up in front of the center. Children poured out, laughing and chattering as their teachers directed them toward the entrance. Today's field trip was to the newly completed exhibition on the history of Millfield's farm families. Harold left a generous tip for Sophia and walked slowly across the street. One of the teachers spotted him and waved enthusiastically. "Mr. Jenkins. Perfect timing. Would you mind saying a few words to the children about farming in the old days?" Harold smiled, suddenly remembering his father explaining how to test soil by its smell and texture, how to read the weather in the shape of clouds, how to respect the land that sustained them. "I'd be happy to," he replied, following the excited group inside the building that had once represented everything he had lost, and now symbolized everything he had helped restore. As the children gathered around him, eager faces upturned and curious, Harold began, "This land has a story to tell you. It's a story about loss and recovery, about justice and healing. It begins with a family farm, much like the ones your great-grandparents might have had, and in that moment, surrounded by the future of Millfield, Harold Jenkins knew that some victories aren't measured in dollars or retribution, but in truths acknowledged and communities renewed. The old man with the sack had finally completed his long journey home. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe for more inspiring stories like this one. Have you ever stood up for what's right even when the odds seemed impossible? Share your experiences in the comments below.